She thought she was just buying an abandoned airfield, but beneath the rust and silence lay a secret buried for generations, one tied to her blood, her past, and a machine capable of bending time itself. Stay until the end, because what Amara discovers will challenge everything humanity believes about reality. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from, hit subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. More stories like this are coming. The wind howled across the empty land, carrying with it the scent of rust and dust, the kind of smell that clung to places forgotten by time. Amara Baldwin stood at the edge of the cracked tarmac, her boots sinking slightly into the weeds that had conquered what was once a runway. 22 acres of silence stretched before her. Abandoned hangars with sagging roofs, broken windows, and graffiti faded by decades of sun. To anyone else, it was nothing but a ruin, a graveyard for machines that no longer had a purpose. But to Amara, it was a chance, maybe her last, to rebuild a life that had been broken too many times. She had signed the papers 2 weeks ago, her hands trembling slightly as she wrote her name on the deed. The place was listed as County Airstrip 17, shuttered in the late 1970s and left to rot since the Cold War's end. The price had been laughably low, proof of how little anyone wanted it. Her old auto shop in town had gone under 6 months earlier, and selling her grandmother's house had barely given her enough money to start over. But when she first saw the aerial photo of the property, all that open space, the promise of isolation, something inside her whispered that this was where she needed to be. Silence, she murmured, her voice almost lost in the wind. That was what she had been searching for. Not the silence of defeat, but the kind that could heal. The world had never made things easy for Amara. Being a black woman in a field dominated by men meant she was constantly underestimated, dismissed, and overlooked. Clients doubted her skills. Suppliers spoke down to her. Even her so-called business partner, a man she had once trusted, had emptied their shared account and disappeared overnight. That betrayal had been the final blow. She had sworn never to rely on anyone again. And here, standing in the middle of nowhere with a socket wrench in one hand and a thermos of cheap coffee in the other, she felt like maybe she wouldn't have to. The first days were spent cleaning. She swept out hangars filled with bird nests and rusted scrap, patched leaks in the roofs with salvaged metal sheets, and repaired what wiring she could. At night, she slept on a cot in a makeshift loft above the main hangar. No plumbing, no electricity, just a battery-powered lantern and the hum of wind through broken windows. The silence wasn't comforting at first. It pressed against her like a weight, as if the land itself was testing whether she would stay. But she endured. Each morning she walked the perimeter with a mug of coffee, boots crunching over broken glass, imagining what this place could become. A new shop, a training center, maybe even a home. On the 12th day, while hauling away a pile of rusted oil drums, she noticed something strange. One of the drums wasn't resting on the ground. It was perched slightly above it, as if hiding something underneath. Curious, Amara kicked it aside and crouched down. Beneath layers of moss and dirt was a steel panel embedded in the ground. At first, she thought it was just part of the old drainage system, but when she brushed away the grime, she saw thick bolts securing it shut and a handle flush with the surface. Faint letters curved along the top, almost invisible in the fading light. "I see 7, she whispered, reading the ghost of a marking. It was a door, and not just any door. It was sealed. Whoever had built it clearly didn't want it opened. A shiver ran down her spine as she touched the metal. It was cold, unnaturally so, like it hadn't felt sunlight in decades. A wave of unease swept over her. This wasn't just some leftover infrastructure, it was deliberate. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide it. And if it wasn't on any of the property documents she'd read, that meant it wasn't meant to be found. That night, Amara couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the steel panel gleaming faintly beneath the soil. Questions gnawed at her. What could be buried under an old airstrip? A storm shelter? A storage vault? Something military? Her grandmother had always been tight-lipped about the family's past, especially about Amara's grandfather, who had worked on government projects before vanishing mysteriously in the 1970s. The thought made her heart pound harder. Could this be connected? By dawn, her curiosity had beaten her caution. Armed with a pry bar, a headlamp, and an old portable grinder, Amara returned to the site. The bolts were industrial grade, welded over and reinforced. Whoever sealed it had done so, intending for it to remain closed forever. But forever had never been a word Amara believed in. The grinder screamed as it bit into the metal, showering sparks across the concrete. Sweat stung her eyes and the smell of scorched steel filled the air. It took hours, but by late afternoon the last weld cracked open with a sharp metallic groan. The handle shifted under her grip. She hesitated. Her heart thudded in her chest, heavy with the weight of the unknown, but she had come too far to turn back now. She braced her boot against the edge and pulled. The door resisted at first, then groaned as it lifted, revealing a narrow spiral staircase disappearing into darkness. A rush of cold air flowed up, sharp and stale, as if exhaled by something ancient. Amara's breath caught. Every rational thought screamed at her to stop, to call someone, to report it, to walk away. But she didn't, because Amara Baldwin didn't walk away from mysteries. She solved them. Clutching her headlamp, she descended into the dark. Each step echoed softly against the concrete, swallowed by the silence below. The deeper she went, the colder it grew. The air smelled of dust and machine oil, and something else, something older. At the bottom of the stairs, a corridor stretched forward, lined with reinforced walls and heavy doors. It felt like a tomb, sealed and forgotten. Her light swept over a rusted sign bolted to the wall. The words, barely legible through layers of grime, made her freeze. Baldwin authorized personnel only. Her last name, her family, carved into a wall buried beneath an abandoned airfield. Amara stood motionless, her heart pounding in her ears. Whatever this place was, it wasn't random, it wasn't coincidence, it was part of her, part of a story that someone had tried very hard to erase. And in that moment, standing in the dark with her name staring back at her from the past, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She hadn't just bought an airfield, she had bought a secret. And it had been waiting for her. The first night after finding her name in concrete, Amara didn't lie down so much as lean against wakefulness. The wind moved the hangar's sheet metal like a giant's breath, and every creak sounded like a hinge turning somewhere below her feet. She tried to convince herself to wait for daylight, to make a plan, to be careful. But care had never gotten her far. Work had. So before the horizon even admitted morning, she was already back at the hatch with a thermos, a pry bar, and the one cheap courage she could afford: momentum. Cold rushed up to meet her as she lifted the steel plate the rest of the way. The spiral stairs swallowed her headlamp's beam like a throat-drinking light. She went anyway, left hand on the inner rail, right hand guiding the beam. Concrete steps curved down through silence dense enough to feel. At the bottom, the corridor yawned forward. Poured walls, rebar ribs showing in places, conduits pinned with ancient clamps, doors set at intervals like sealed thoughts. Her light passed over another sign, smaller, less rusted, more deliberate. IC, sublevel, A authorized, Baldwin. Her name again. No shrugging it off now as coincidence. Whoever built this place hadn't just known the Baldwins, they'd engineered the family into the room. The first door she tried refused her, unmoving. The second had split along its frame, probably from settling. She shouldered it once, then twice, then set the pry bar and levered until the metal complained and gave. The smell inside mixed dust and machine oil with the dry bite of ancient paper. A laboratory in freeze frame, metal benches bolted to the floor, glass front cabinets with crazed panes, a wall of dull, eye-level screens curved like early television sets. Everywhere, labels. Power test rig 3, core brace, Rev E, field coil, do not move. She moved slowly, not out of reverence, but to make the world keep up. The cabinet locks had gone brittle with time. A twist with the bar snapped them. Folders slid free, shedding grit. She carried the first stack to a bench and brushed a sleeve across the surface until the dust lifted in a gray cloud. Her headlamp pooled light over titles stamped in block letters. Project Icarus, System Overview, Flight Logs, Ike Series Reactive Compression, Core, Materials, Icarus. The name landed in her chest with the weight of a story everyone pretends not to know. We built wings. We flew too close. We burned. But as she opened the first binder, the metaphor peeled away and left diagrams, equations, assembly notes, sign-offs, signatures. A signature she recognized before her brain supplied it. W. Baldwin. Letters written with a pressure she remembered from a box of Christmas cards her grandmother once refused to throw away. Her grandfather didn't belong to a bedtime story anymore. He belonged to the room. She read until the cold in her hands climbed her arms. The language walked the tightrope between aerospace engineering and something that felt like trespass. V2OL is a solved preamble, not a frontier. Field harmonics where she expected combustion. Resonant confinement lattice where there should have been the turbine maps. Every so often a note in the margin, tighter handwriting, humor edged with fatigue. If you have to ask why no fire, read page 42 again. On page 42, a diagram showed energy moving not through fuel, but through pattern. Fields coaxed into singing the right note until the air itself remembered how to carry weight. She closed her eyes, pressed her palms to her temples, and saw the shop she'd lost. Wrenches catching morning light. A radio the color of nicotine stains. The way every good fix begins not with a part, but with a principle. An engine was a promise you kept over and over. Whatever they'd built down here asked for a different kind of promise. The second binder didn't ask. It told. Flight logs, IC marched down the spine, dates in the early 1970s typed in hard, uniform letters. Inside, weather, altitude, time aloft, then stranger columns, VTL functionality, field stability, anomalous return delta. She traced a finger along one entry, IC7, pilot, R, Albright, duration, 0 hours, 6 minutes and 13 seconds, max alt, classified, return delta, 1234, non-local, pilot status, partial recovery, non-local, return delta. Words that dodged explanation by pretending to be math. At the back of the lab, a bank of equipment blinked faintly at the edge of awareness, one green dot winking the way lighthouses do for sailors who have forgotten the coast. Power shouldn't still live down here. Not after decades. Amara approached, expecting the light to die under scrutiny. It didn't. A panel hum met her the way a sleeping dog's exhale does. Present, harmless until it isn't. She found a switch she could understand and toggled it. Nothing dramatic. No chorus, no startup fanfare, Just a screen warming through sepia to gray, then letters crawling from left to right like a language learning to wake. Welcome, Baldwin. Archive integrity, 63%. Reconstruct interface, YN. Her throat worked. Why? She said, before reminding herself it was asking for a keystroke, not a confession. But her finger landed on the old plastic key and pressed anyway. The screen flickered. A patient processing bar made of little blocks walked across, and somewhere below the floor something as gentle as a refrigerator motor rumbled, then stilled. Down the corridor, a knock sounded. Amara lifted her head, heartbeat miscounting. The knock wasn't in the bunker. It came from far above, where the wind made doors into instruments. She snapped off the monitor, killed her lamp, and stood in the kind of darkness that swallows shape. The second knock, 3 quick raps, found its answer in the way her body moved. Back the way she came, steps careful, one hand sliding the rail, breath quieted to the minimum possible. By the time she reached the surface, the sky had made up its mind to be morning. Blue slicked over the east. The hangar threw its long angles across weed and concrete. A man stood near her truck, hands visible, posture that late career soldiers learn, at ease with a seam of readiness stitched in. He was tall and thinner than his jacket wanted him to be. Hair cut short the color of winter's steel. A shortwave radio hung at his hip like a habit. He didn't turn until she was 10 steps from him. When he did, his eyes didn't widen in surprise. They narrowed like he was bracing for a gust. "You're Baldwin," he said, a statement that left her yes unnecessary. "Name's Amara." Let him hear the part that mattered to her. "Who are you, and why are you on my land?" "Silas Boone," he answered. "I used to work here." "Nobody used to work here." She gestured toward the hangar. This was mothballed in the 70s and then forgotten. He let the sentence lie a moment. "Forgotten," he said, tasting the word. "That's one way to say it." His gaze ticked past her shoulder toward the far hangar. "You opened the hatch." She didn't answer. "I figured you might when I saw the deed change hands," he said. "Figured it might be you or nobody." Amara shifted her weight. "That a threat?" "It's the opposite." He lifted his hands a little higher, palms empty. "You'll want answers. I can give you some, not all. No one can give you all." He didn't move closer. She didn't invite him to, but she gestured toward the shade line and the side door, not because hospitality had surfaced in her, but because visibility had. Inside, the hangar's air was 10 degrees cooler and smelled of rust trying to remember the shape of rain. They sat on opposite sides of a workbench that had once been part of someone else's dream. Silas placed a dented metal canister on the table and nudged it with 2 fingers. "Coffee. No offense." She eyed it and poured her own thermos instead. "Start with why my name is written on walls under my property." "Because your grandfather wrote it there," he said simply. "Because he helped build the place where those walls lead." "W. Baldwin," she said, and the way his mouth twitched told her the test had landed where she'd aimed it. "You found the binders," he said, not a question. "I found words," she allowed. "Some of them make sense to me. Some of them pretend to." Silas worked the radio strap with his thumb. The gesture said nervous. The rest of him said practiced. "It was called Project Icarus," he said, officially. Unofficially, it was called half a dozen other things depending on who needed what and how fast. "What did you need?" Amara asked. "The same thing everyone does at an airfield," he said, "to get off the ground. A beat. Clean propulsion was the pitch. No combustion, no signature. Verticals that didn't gouge the world to lift you out of it. And the catch?" He nodded once, grateful to skip the preamble. It worked, he said, and the two syllables slid into the space between them like a loaded tray. That was the catch. People like to hear that the future failed because it comforts the present. His version denied her that comfort. Define worked, she said. The craft lifted, flew, returned, he said, but it didn't always come back as it left. And neither did the pilots. She felt the word pilots holster other words, bodies, names, costs, and braced herself. How many flights? Enough to make a report, not enough to make a doctrine. His eyes tracked the hangar's ribs. One pilot, Rory Albright, did 6 clean runs. On the 7th, the craft disappeared from every instrument for 12 minutes. When it returned, he did 2. His jaw worked. For 3 days he spoke in poetry, not like a style, like a weather pattern, things he'd never read. Then he stopped speaking at all. Medical? She asked. Everything and nothing. Brain scans like snow. Blood work that couldn't agree with itself. He pinched the bridge of his nose. Another pilot came back with an extra molar. Another without his enlistment memories. The craft returned with inscriptions on its fasteners, microscopic, a language we couldn't place. The metal stress didn't map to the flight profile. The weight was wrong by grams we could measure and couldn't explain. He waited for her to flinch. She didn't. If the world wanted to surprise her, it needed sharper teeth. "And my grandfather?" she asked. "Genius," Silas said, not like a compliment but like a diagnosis. "Stubborn. He held the line when the men with stars decided clean propulsion could do things bullets never would. He said the core wasn't just an engine, it was an instrument. It didn't push against the air. It persuaded the air to remember a different rule." Amara heard herself breathe. In, out. Count the beats. Don't let wonder erase caution. So why shut it down? Because the room changed. He said it as if the room were a person. Because when field strength went up, clocks didn't exactly agree. Because men who smelled like appropriations wanted to put it on an aircraft carrier. Because your grandfather wrote a sentence on a page that I have not slept through since. What sentence? If they knew what it touched, they'd bury it in concrete and salt. She could see him see the line again, how it had cut in and stayed. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a thin paper envelope taped at the seams so dust couldn't claim it. He didn't offer it across yet. He held it like you hold a letter bomb you've already decided to love. "He wrote a letter the night before we shut the sublevel down," Silas said. "Told me to give it to the next Baldwin who found the door." A sad twitch at the corner of his mouth. "I spent half a life hoping there wouldn't be a next Baldwin." "And yet," she said. "And yet," he echoed and slid the envelope across. Her name thrummed under his handwriting even before she turned it over. She worked the tape with a utility knife, folded the flap back, and eased the single page into light. His script had always been a little canted, a road learning a hill. The words were steady now as a winter tree. "To the one who carries my name and my hands. If you found this, it means the door wouldn't stay asleep. Know this. The thing we built is not a weapon and not a ride. It is a question that answers back. Do not fly it because you are afraid. Do not fly it because you are brave. If you love this world, teach the hatch to close." Her eyes blurred halfway through, and then sharpened again as if her body had decided that reading counted as breathing. She folded the page along the crease time had already taught it, slid it back into its nest, and set the envelope on the bench as though heat might hurt it. "You think he was wrong," she said, not because she believed it, but because the shape of the conversation needed pressure to hold. "I think he was right in a room that doesn't exist," Silas said. I think the men with budgets will always find doors that don't belong to them. I think if I walk out of here and pretend I don't know you found this place, men who fail upward will arrive with legal reasons to break your bones." He lifted his eyes to hers. "And I think you already decided something before I walked onto your land." She let the quiet answer for her. Decision wasn't a flash for her, it was a sediment that settled until it became bedrock. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Context," he said, "history, the warning that I wasn't offered until too late. And one more thing I hate giving, which is help." They returned underground. The lab felt different with another set of lungs in it, less like trespass, more like inventory. Silas moved as if his feet remembered distances his eyes had forgotten. He showed her the broken hinge to a door she hadn't tried, the way to wedge a pry bar under the frame without shredding it. Beyond that door, a smaller room gathered itself around a metal table that must have been installed before the walls cured. No other way it would have fit. On it, a binder the color of arterial paint, spine cracked, tabs worn velveteen by thumbs long retired. Project Icarus. Red file do not duplicate. Amara's gloves squeaked on vinyl as she opened it. Not a manual, a mind. Sketches that became schematics. Instrumentation notes that bled into questions. Flight data that tilted into the margins and came back with edges scorched. Someone had taped a photograph to a page with yellowed strips. In the photo, a craft shaped like a thought hovered 3 feet above a hangar floor with no landing gear and no visible means to pretend gravity hadn't been invented. Silas stood at her shoulder without crowding her and pointed once, gently, at a notation in the corner in the crooked ink. W. Baldwin. "He let someone take that picture?" she asked. "He let the future take it," Silas said. "Our cameras were just the excuse." They read until the hour lost its edges. The archive terminal across the lab cycled its quiet blink, alive without boasting, patient without apology. When they finally looked up, the kind of hunger you only notice when a mystery pauses for breath made itself known. Silas's canister coffee turned out to be terrible, which counted as proof of life. "What do you want me to do now?" she asked into the steam, the question honest and heavier than she liked. "I want you to know the shape of the thing before you decide you're the one meant to carry it," he said. "I want you to understand that the project didn't fail. It worked too well to trust the world with it." Amara closed the red file and set her palm on its cover like you steady a heart. Upstairs, the wind found a seam and sang through it in a single high note. Down here, the room waited the way a room does when it belongs to a next chapter it can't write for you. She rolled her shoulders, felt the grit at her collarbone, and looked at the bank of dead screens, the blinking terminal, the binders that had slept longer than she'd been alive. The path ahead didn't glitter. It darkened and invited. She wasn't afraid of that kind of road. Fear looks like a choice. For her, it rarely had been. "All right," she said, more to the concrete than to the man. "Now I know." The binders waited. The envelope waited. And somewhere under all of it, a machine listened the way an ocean does. Indifferent, enormous, willing to teach anyone who learned how to hear. Amara hadn't slept more than an hour in 3 days. The airstrip, once a graveyard of twisted metal and empty sky, now pulsed with an electricity that wasn't just mechanical. It was personal. Every page she read, every diagram she deciphered, every note in her grandfather's scrawled handwriting dragged her deeper into a history she hadn't asked to inherit but could no longer walk away from. This wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was about blood, about identity, about a story written into the bones of her family long before she was born. The red binder became her scripture. By the second day, its pages were dog-eared, annotated with grease-stained notes of her own. It wasn't a manual. It was a diary in equations and physics, part memoir, part confession. Her grandfather had been documenting something far more radical than propulsion. Time bends, not breaks, one note read. Another, if they knew what it touched, they'd bury it in concrete and salt. Over and over, the same phrase appeared beside certain diagrams. Project Icarus, Phase 2, Conscious Field Interface. Amara's breath would always catch at those words. Conscious Field Interface. It sounded less like engineering and more like sorcery, but the deeper she read, the clearer it became. Icarus hadn't just been about flight, it was about interaction, not pushing against the world, but changing the rules it played by. The list of test pilots haunted her. 6 names, 5 of them crossed out with neat notations, retired, discharged, medically unstable. The 6th, R. Albright, bore no such closure. Just a cryptic line. Test 7, duration unknown, recovery partial. She flipped the page and stopped cold. A grainy photograph stared back at her. A triangular craft hovering silently 2 feet above the hangar floor. No landing gear, no exhaust, no visible means of lift. Beneath it, air shimmered like rippling water, and standing beside it was a man in a flight suit, his helmet tucked under one arm. His face was blurred, burned into obscurity by time or perhaps something stranger. In the bottom corner, scrawled in faint ink, IC-7, Albright. It was the audio transcript that finally unsettled her. A black box recording from the final test. At first, the pilot's voice was calm, professional. Altitude stable, no visual markers, feels like fog, dry fog, not air. Then his tone shifted, strained and confused. Feels like memory, like breathing someone else's dream. The next line wasn't his voice at all. It was something else, deep, resonant, aware. We remember you, Baldwin. The page trembled in her hands. She wasn't afraid of ghost stories or classified secrets, but this was different. This was her family's name spoken by something that shouldn't exist, something that was still listening. Later that night, while clearing a collapsed storage room, Amara found a film reel tucked inside a corroded metal canister marked IC-5. Curiosity overrode caution. She set up the old projector in the control room and watched the film sputter to life. What she saw froze her breath. The craft in flight, flickering in and out of existence as if reality itself couldn't decide whether to hold on to it. Each time it returned, something about it had changed. Its shape, its surface, even its proportions. In the final frame, her grandfather walked into view, staring directly into the camera, and he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It wasn't sinister either. It was knowing. And it sent a chill through her spine because it felt like he was looking through the camera, past time, past memory, and directly into her. By dawn, the film was still replaying in her mind. She walked the length of the bunker corridors with the binder clutched to her chest, trying to reconcile everything she had learned with everything she thought she knew. The more she pieced together, the less it felt like a scientific project and the more it felt like an invitation, one her grandfather had left for her and her alone. That's when she found the crates. Heavy steel containers stacked in a sealed sub-vault she hadn't noticed before. With a crowbar and hours of persistence, she pried them open one by one. Inside were components, not like any engine parts she'd ever seen. Cylindrical tubes etched with spiral patterns that seemed to shift when she stared too long. Transparent alloy plates that weighed almost nothing. Coils wrapped in metallic fibers that shimmered like liquid graphite. They didn't look manufactured. They looked grown. She brought several pieces back to the hangar and laid them carefully across a workbench. For the first time in years, she felt alive in the way she had when she first rebuilt an engine as a teenager. Except this was something far beyond pistons and timing belts. This was history. This was destiny. That night, she decided to run a simple test. Using the last working multimeter from her old shop, she applied a small voltage across one of the smaller coils. What happened next made her drop the leads in shock. The coil didn't receive power, it generated its own. The reading spiked far beyond what she had supplied. A piercing, resonant tone filled the room, high and delicate, like a glass about to shatter. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Heart pounding, she yanked the wires free and stumbled back. Whatever this was, it wasn't dead technology. It was active. The next morning, Silas was waiting for her when she stepped into the hangar. He stood silently, his gaze fixed on the parts scattered across her table. "You opened the binder," he said without greeting. "I did," she replied, refusing to hide it. "This technology doesn't belong in civilian hands," he said. "I'm not a civilian," Amara snapped, louder than she intended. "This is my family's legacy. My grandfather built this. My name is carved into those walls." Silas sighed, the weight of decades pressing down on his shoulders, and they buried it because it worked too well. He picked up one of the components carefully, as if it might bite. "This isn't propulsion, Amara. It's a field generator. It doesn't just make a craft fly, it makes it disappear. From radar, from satellites, maybe even from sight." Amara stared at him, her throat suddenly dry. "Then why bury it?" "Because the last time it was tested," Silas said quietly, "it didn't just vanish from the sky. It was gone for 12 minutes. And when it came back, the pilot wasn't the same." She swallowed. "What do you mean?" He remembered things that hadn't happened yet. People who weren't born, wars that hadn't been fought. He screamed about light that breathed. Silas turned to her, his expression haunted. "Your grandfather called it a miracle. I called it a mistake." The words clung to her like smoke. Light that breathed. She wanted to laugh it off, to call it superstition, but the evidence on her workbench said otherwise. And deep down, beneath the fear and doubt, another feeling was rising: inevitability. This wasn't just technology. It wasn't just history. It was hers. When Silas left, Amara sat alone in the control room with the binder open across her lap. The equations no longer looked like abstract theory. They looked like a map. And the more she studied them, the more she realized something unsettling. She didn't just understand them. She felt them. Like muscle memory she shouldn't have. Like part of her had been preparing for this moment her entire life. By the time the sun rose again, she knew what she had to do. She wasn't here to read about Project Icarus. She wasn't here to admire her grandfather's legacy from a distance. She was here to finish what he started. The morning the black SUVs arrived, the wind was eerily still. It was the kind of silence that wrapped around the airfield before a storm. Not the noisy kind that rattled windows, but the heavy, inevitable kind that pressed against the skin and whispered that something was coming. Amara knew it before she saw them. She had felt it building for days, the way tension builds in a wire stretched too far. The moment she decided to assemble the engine, there was no turning back. Someone, somewhere, had been watching. By then, the hangar looked nothing like the place she had first stepped into weeks before. The once empty floor was now transformed into a crude laboratory. Blueprints taped to the walls, components laid out with surgical precision, tools scattered like instruments of war. In the center of it all stood the thing that had consumed her every waking hour, The Icarus craft, or what remained of it. A skeletal fuselage of matte black alloy, panels engraved with patterns that seemed to pulse faintly when touched, and a core chamber that hummed softly even when unpowered. It wasn't finished, not yet, but it was close. Amara had spent the last 3 nights without sleep, soldering, bolting, recalibrating. Every diagram in the red binder had become muscle memory. Every equation had burned itself into her thoughts. She wasn't just building a machine. She was resurrecting a legacy buried under decades of fear and silence. And as much as she hated to admit it, she was doing it for more than just her grandfather. She was doing it for herself, for every time the world had told her she couldn't, for every door that had been closed in her face. "Are you sure about this?" Silas asked from the doorway. He'd been watching her work for hours, his arms crossed, his face a mix of awe and dread. "I have to know," Amara said without looking up. Her hands moved with quiet determination, fastening a coil into place. "I have to know why it changed, why it came back, different." He stepped closer, his boots scraping against the concrete. "You're not just looking for answers, you're looking for meaning. And I'm telling you, meaning is the most dangerous thing this project ever promised." She paused, meeting his eyes. "You told me once that this thing was a question that answers back. Well, I'm done asking questions. It's time for answers." Silas exhaled slowly, then reached into his coat pocket and handed her a folded piece of paper. "Then you're going to need this." Amara unfolded it carefully. It wasn't a passcode, it was a series of symbols, intricate, almost beautiful in their complexity. But she recognized them instantly. She had seen them carved into the engine casing, etched into the blueprint margins, scrawled in her grandpa's notes. "They're not instructions," Silas said. "They're coordinates, thought patterns. The machine doesn't respond to buttons. It responds to intention. This sequence, it's how he talked to it." "Talk to it?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "Icarus doesn't unlock. It listens. And when it decides you're ready, it answers." Before she could reply, a low rumble reached them from outside, the unmistakable sound of heavy tires crunching gravel. Amara's chest tightened. Silas moved to the window, his jaw hardening as he looked out. "They found us," he muttered. A convoy of unmarked black SUVs rolled through the overgrown entrance, engines idling low, doors opening in unison. Men in dark suits and tactical gear fanned out across the property, their movements precise and deliberate. This wasn't local law enforcement, this was federal, military, government. Amara didn't hesitate. She climbed into the cockpit. "Amara," Silas started, but she cut him off. "I'm not letting them bury this again," she said firmly. "Not after everything I've seen. Not after what my grandfather built." The cockpit felt familiar beneath her hands, as if she'd sat there before in another lifetime. Her fingers danced over the console, inputting the symbol sequence Silas had given her. One by one, the indicators blinked to life. The hum of the core deepened, resonating through the floor. Outside, the agents were shouting commands now, their rifles raised, their boots pounding toward the hangar. Silas stepped into the doorway, arms spread wide, not in surrender, but in defiance. "Don't you dare fire!" he shouted at them. "You don't know what's in there." Amara took a deep breath and pressed enter. The world held its breath with her. A deep vibration rippled through the hangar floor. Lights along the fuselage flared to life, blue at first, then white-hot, pulsing like a heartbeat. The craft shuddered, then stilled. Outside, the agents stumbled as a dome of invisible force exploded outward, knocking them off their feet and rocking the SUVs on their suspensions. The air inside the cockpit thickened. It wasn't heat or cold, it was density, like space itself was folding inward. The display in front of her flickered wildly, the symbol sequence pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. Her breath grew shallow. The machine was listening. She whispered the words she had read over and over in her grandfather's notes, the words underlined 3 times in the red binder. If you love this world. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The Icarus lifted. It didn't rise with thrust or force. It floated, weightless, as if gravity itself had forgotten her. The hangar lights flickered, glass shattered in their frames, and a wave of wind roared outward, flattening the grass and sending the agents diving for cover. Silas didn't move. He stood his ground, staring up at the rising craft with something that wasn't fear. It was awe. And then came the light. It wasn't blinding. It was warm, gentle, golden, like the first rays of morning after a storm. The edges of the cockpit blurred, the metal walls melted into color, and time itself seemed to stretch and twist. Amara's thoughts unraveled and reassembled all at once. Memories that weren't hers flooded her mind. Languages she'd never spoken, faces she'd never seen, events that hadn't happened yet. It was overwhelming and exhilarating all at once. She felt known, as if the machine wasn't just carrying her somewhere, but showing her something. How long she was gone, she couldn't say. Seconds, hours, years. It all blurred into one continuous heartbeat. But when the light receded and the cockpit came back into focus, the world below was different. The air felt charged. The ground looked older. The buildings were weathered in ways they hadn't been minutes before. And where there had once been armed men and black SUVs, there was only dust. Silas was gone. The hangar was empty. And the sky itself looked softer, like the light had learned a new way to shine. Amara guided the craft back down gently, her hands trembling. The landing was silent, graceful. No alarms, no sirens, just the whisper of wind through the broken fences. When the hatch opened and she stepped onto the cracked tarmac, the world exhaled. Everything, the land, the air, the silence, felt lighter, as if the universe itself had been holding its breath and had finally let go. Somewhere deep inside, she knew, this was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The machine had shown her a glimpse of something far beyond human understanding. And now it was up to her to decide what to do with it. The past was no longer buried. The future was no longer waiting. It was here. And so was she. The world Amara returned to was not the one she had left behind. It looked the same at first glance. The cracked runway stretched out under an open sky, the hangars still slumped under the weight of decades. But the details were wrong. The air tasted charged, metallic, alive. The horizon shimmered faintly, as if the atmosphere itself was breathing. And most unsettling of all, the men who had surrounded her hangar with rifles and orders were gone. Their vehicles had vanished. The echoes of their boots, their shouts, erased as though they had never existed. Amara climbed down from the cockpit with trembling hands, her boots crunching softly on the tarmac. The craft hummed quietly behind her, a low, resonant sound like the purr of some vast sleeping creature. She reached into her back pocket and pulled out the letter, the one her grandfather had written decades ago, the one Silas had given her with shaking hands. If you love this world, close the hatch. She read it 3 times, then she folded it gently and slid it back into her pocket. He had never meant close, as in seal it forever. He had meant understand it first. To control something, you had to understand it. And for the first time, Amara realized that was exactly what she was meant to do. The bunker was different, too. She noticed it the moment she descended the spiral staircase again. The air was colder, but cleaner. The dust that had hung in the air like a ghost was gone. Some of the sealed doors she had once found rusted shut now stood slightly ajar, and faint lights pulsed down the corridor, lights that hadn't been on before. The Icarus hadn't just flown, it had woken something up. Deeper inside, she found the control room alive with soft green illumination. Screens that had been dark now hummed with data streams. Words scrolled across monitors in languages she didn't recognize. On one screen, a map rotated slowly, not of Earth, but of the stars. She stared at it, breathless. The coordinates didn't match anything she'd ever seen. They weren't destinations, they were possibilities. Time bends, not breaks, her grandfather had written, and now she understood. Icarus wasn't built to conquer the sky, it was designed to step beyond it. A sudden sound made her turn. Footsteps, steady, deliberate, echoed down the corridor. For a brief, wild second, she thought it might be Silas. But when the figure stepped into the glow, she froze. It was a man, older than her, with silver hair and eyes that held centuries. His face was familiar in a way that made her heart seize. "Rory Albright," he said simply, as if introducing himself at a dinner party. Amara's knees almost buckled. "That's not possible," she whispered. "You disappeared." He smiled faintly. "So did you." "I was gone for minutes," she said. "Were you?" His gaze softened. "Or were you gone for years you don't remember?" Her throat went dry. "Where did you go?" Albright stepped closer, his presence oddly calm. "Not where, Amara. When. Icarus doesn't travel through space. It travels through the fabric underneath space. Time, probability, memory. It shows you what was, what could be, what will be, if you dare to look." "And what did you see?" she asked, barely able to breathe. "Everything," he said quietly, "and nothing. Futures that end before they begin. Pasts that loop back on themselves. People who never existed and people who always have." He paused, his eyes locking with hers. "I saw you, standing exactly where you are, holding a choice that changes everything." "What choice?" "To finish what was started." The words echoed inside her like the pulse of the engine. Finish it. Complete it. Let it become what it was always meant to be. That night, she worked until her hands bled. The machine was nearly whole, the fuselage complete, the field generator stable, the propulsion array balanced. But one final piece was missing, the reactive compression core, the heart of Icarus. It had to be built from scratch, guided by her grandfather's designs and her own intuition. It took every ounce of strength, every calculation, every sleepless hour. And when it was done, the craft didn't look like a machine anymore. It looked like a living thing, smooth, seamless, humming with a pulse that matched her own heartbeat. As dawn broke over the horizon, Amara stood before the machine in silence. The airfield was quiet. No agents, no sirens, no interruptions. The choice was hers alone. "Are you ready?" Albright's voice came from behind her. She nodded slowly. "I don't think anyone ever really is." She climbed into the cockpit one last time, the control panel lit up before she touched a thing, responding to her presence. The symbol sequence appeared again on the screen, the same one Silas had given her, but this time it completed itself. Her fingerprints, her heartbeat, her thoughts, all of it syncing with the machine. A voice, calm, mechanical, yet impossibly human, spoke from the console. "Baldwin lineage confirmed. Icarus ready." Her grandfather's words whispered in her memory. It doesn't belong to the sky. It belongs to what waits beyond it. She exhaled slowly, steadying her hands. Then, let's see what's waiting. The engine hummed, rising in pitch. The walls of the hangar shook. The air grew dense again, folding, bending, rippling like water. The world outside blurred, and then, with no explosion, no roar, no violence, the Icarus rose. It slipped upward like a thought escaping a dream, weightless and infinite. The sky peeled back, space unfurled, and for the first time in human history, a machine built by human hands reached not for the stars, but for the spaces between them. Time stretched, reality bent, and Amara Baldwin, mechanic, orphan, outcast, became the first to cross the boundary her grandfather had died protecting. What lay beyond was impossible to describe. Colors that didn't exist, sounds that felt like emotions, glimpses of futures yet to be born. She felt connected to it all. The past, the present, the infinite web of possibility that stretched before her. And in that boundless expanse, one truth anchored her. This was never about escape. It was about understanding. When the light finally dimmed and the Icarus returned to the sky it had left behind, the airfield was silent again. But Amara was no longer the same woman who had once stood on its broken tarmac. She walked across the runway slowly, the wind carrying her name like a promise. She had uncovered a legacy, faced the unknown, and chosen not to fear it. She hadn't just flown a machine. She had rewritten the story of what was possible, and somewhere, far above, the stars blinked, as if they, too, were watching. She came to escape her past, but instead she uncovered a legacy that rewrote the future. Amara didn't just fly a machine, she crossed the boundary of the impossible and proved that courage runs deeper than fear. If this story moved you, subscribe, hit the like button, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to comment where you're watching from. Your voice keeps these stories alive.